وَلَقَدْ يَسَّرْنَا الْقُرْآنَ لِلذِّكْرِ فَهَلْ مِن مُّدَّكِرٍ.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, dear viewers. You are welcome to yet another episode of our program, Quran Made Easy, reaching you from MTA Africa. On this program, we are trying to acquaint ourselves with the practical steps involved in the recitation of the Holy Quran, the same way it was revealed to the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. In our last episode, we were able to conclude our discussion on the correct pronunciation of all the Arabic alphabet, the 28 Arabic alphabets we have in Arabic language. Today, inshallah, we shall look at the recitation and the rules guiding the recitation of isti'ādha and basmalah. The word isti'ādha literally means seeking refuge with Allah against shaitan, the accursed. And how do we do that? By saying, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. That is isti'ādha. That is, I seek refuge with Allah against shaitan, the accursed. That is isti'ādha. So it is a Quranic injunction. When you want to recite the Quran, what do you do first? You seek refuge with Allah against shaitan, as found in Surah An-Nahl, and that is Quran chapter 16, verse 99, where Allah the Almighty says, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, فَإِذَا قَرَأْتَ الْقُرْآنَ فَاسْتَعِذْ بِاللَّهِ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ فَإِذَا قَرَأْتَ الْقُرْآنَ فَاسْتَعِذْ بِاللَّهِ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ. Meaning, whenever you recite the Quran, seek refuge with Allah against shaitan, the accursed. So saying A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim is sanctioned by the Holy Quran. Then the second one is the basmalah. Basmalah means saying Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. As we are all aware, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim is the first verse of every surah of the Quran except Surah At-Tawbah. So saying A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim and Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim is part of the recitation of the Quran. And that is why we are going to discuss that today. So there are some rules guiding the recitation of the isti'ādha, that is A'udhu billah, and the basmalah. The first of these rules is what we call qat'ul jami' or qat'ul kulli, that is splitting all. Here we have three variables. We have the isti'ādha, the A'udhu billah, we have the basmalah, that is the bismillah, and we have the surah that we intend to recite. For instance, I want to recite Surah Al-Ikhlas, Qul huwa Allahu ahad. I want to recite Surah Al-Ikhlas. I will start with A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, then I will follow it with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, then I move on to the surah I want to recite. So these are the three variables we have. Now the first rule guiding the recitation is to split all the three variables. That is, I recite A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, I take a pause. I recite Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, I take a pause. Then I recite the surah I intend to recite. Now let us practicalize that. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Qul huwa Allahu ahad. So that is the first method we can use, that is qat'ul jami', that is splitting all the variables, pronouncing each one and taking a pause before you pronounce the next one. So the second one is qat'ul isti'ādha wa waslul basmalati bis surah, which means you reciting the isti'ādha separately, that is, you take a pause after you recite isti'ādha, Then when you now recite the basmalah, you join the basmalah with the beginning of the surah you intend to recite. We say, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. Then you take a pause. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد. So that is, you have joined the basmalah with the surah. So you recited the isti'ādha separately, you take a pause after it, then you join the basmalah with the surah. So that is the second method that is also acceptable in your recitation of isti'ādha and basmalah. Then the third method is by you joining the isti'ādha and the basmalah. Then after the basmalah, you take a pause before you now recite the surah. That means you are joining the isti'ādha with the basmalah. You now take a pause and then you recite the surah. So let us practicalize that also. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Then you take a pause. قل هو الله أحد. So you have joined the isti'ādha with the basmalah and you have taken a pause before you now recite the surah you wish to recite. The last is you joining the three variables. You join the isti'ādha, you don't take a pause after isti'ādha, you read basmalah, then you join it also with the surah you want to recite. So you only take that pause after the surah you have recited. Let us practicalize it. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد. So you have joined all the three together. So these four methods are acceptable in the recitation of isti'ādha and basmalah. However, one has to be very careful when you are employing any method that involves you joining any of the variables with the next one. And what you should be careful about is the letter, the last letter of that variable. For instance, the last letter of isti'ādha is mim, and it is carrying fatha. You have to be very conscious of the vowel on that letter. Make sure that the vowel on that letter is pronounced. You know, as a rule in Arabic language and by extension, Quranic recitation, we start our recitation on a vowel and we stop on a sukun. That is, when you want to recite the Quran, you don't start your recitation with sukun. It's not possible. That letter you are reciting first must take a vowel, either a fatha, a kasra, or a dhamma. Then when you are stopping, irrespective of the vowel that letter is carrying, you stop on sukun. You give it a sukun, even though it is not carrying sukun ordinarily. For instance, when you say Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, the noon, which is the last letter of that verse, is carrying fatha ordinarily. It is Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. But as a rule, you don't say Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen unless you are intending to join it with the next verse. But if you want to stop, you want to take a pause after Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, you have to give it a sukun and say Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. You don't say Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen and you now stop. No, that's not acceptable. So now in this method of reciting isti'ādha and basmalah, any method that involves you joining one variable with another, either you are joining the isti'ādha with the basmalah or you are joining the basmalah with the surah, you have to be conscious of the vowel that thing is carrying, the last letter, so that you pronounce the vowel carefully. For instance, if you want to join Bismillah with the surah, you say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Qul huwallahu ahad. Make sure that that mim kasra is pronounced as mi. So it is not pronounced as sukun or in a way that is not correct. So that is one thing we have to be very careful of, so that we don't pronounce the wrong thing. The next thing we have to look at is the recitation of Bismillah in between two surahs. Maybe you are reciting a particular surah and you have recited to the end of that surah. You want to move on to the next surah. And we are all aware that Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim is the first verse of all these surah except Surah Tawbah. So what is the rule guiding the recitation of this Bismillah in between two surahs? So there are three methods that are applicable, that are accepted. The first one is by you splitting all the three variables. The variables we have here now is one, the last letter, the last verse of the preceding surah, the surah you are reciting before. Then we now have the Bismillah that forms the beginning of another surah, followed by the next verse after the Bismillah, meaning we have three. The concluding verse, the Bismillah, and the next verse after Bismillah. So how do you recite it? How do you join this? So you can join the three together. For instance, the last verse of Surah Al-Ikhlas, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدَ اللَّهُ الصَّمَدَ لَمْ يَلِدَ وَلَمْ يُولَدَ وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدَ. So now, how do you recite that? You can say, وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ بِسْمِ اللَّهِ الرَّحْمَنِ الرَّحِيمِ قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ الْفَلَقِ. So you can join everything together. So no, you don't take a pause after any of them. So that is the first method that is acceptable. The second method is by you splitting all. وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. You take a pause. بِسْمِ اللَّهِ الرَّحْمَنِ الرَّحِيمِ. You take a pause. قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ الْفَلَقِ. You take a pause. So that's the second acceptable method. Then the next one is for you to take a pause when you recite the last verse of the surah you are reciting before you now start the Bismillah and join it. وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. You take a pause. Then you now say, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Qul a'udhu bi Rabbil Falaq. So that is the third acceptable method. Now there is the fourth one, which is not acceptable, and you have to be very careful. And that is by you reciting in such a way that gives the impression that the Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim is the concluding verse of the surah you are reciting before. For instance, you now say, وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ بِسْمِ اللَّهِ الرَّحْمَنِ الرَّحِيمِ. You now take a pause. قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ الْفَلَقِ. That is not correct. Because in your recitation, you have given the impression that Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim is the last verse of Surah Al-Ikhlas, which is not. So that is why that method is not acceptable. So let us desist from using that method. So we can use the first three methods. Any of them is acceptable. So these are the rules guiding the recitation of isti'ādha and basmalah, and also the recitation of basmalah, that is Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in between two surahs. So when you are transiting from a surah to the next one, you do not need to repeat A'udhu Billah. And that is why we are not discussing the rule of A'udhu Billahi minash shaitanir rajim in between two surahs. So what you need to recite is the Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And the three rules that I mentioned earlier are applicable. So let me quickly do a recap. The first one is for you to split all the three. The last verse of the preceding surah, the Bismillah, and the next verse. You split them, you recite them independently. Then the next one is by you reciting the last verse. Then you take a pause. You now recite Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and join it with the next verse of the new surah. That's the second method. It is also acceptable. Then the last method is that you recite the concluding verse of the previous surah, then you also join it with the Bismillah. You also join it with the next verse of that surah. So that is the third method that is acceptable. So inshallah, this is how far we can go for this episode. Do join us in our next episode, where we shall be looking at other rules concerning the recitation of the Holy Quran. In case there are inquiries you want to make, there are questions you want to ask, please send them to africa@mta.tv. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.